Okay. Good morning. My name is Suzanne Kelly. I'm a member of Westminster's Social Justice Team. We build our social justice forums around a common theme, and this year our theme is moving from understanding to transformation, affecting change together, guided by God. Through these forums, we want to explore capabilities we need to build and norms we need to examine in order to be effective transformation partners in our community. Today, we're pleased to welcome Reverend Anna Kendig Flores and social justice team member Beth Gillaspey, who will share key takeaways from the 2023 Presbytery of the Twin Cities area. It's a self-assessment on race and equity. The assessment addresses how we can use daily practices to make us more effective and joyful partners in our communities and contexts, and will also reflect on systems of power and how we navigate within them. Anna Kendig Flores, Anna Kendig Flores is a teaching elder and anti-racism coordinator for the Presbytery with over 15 years of race, equity, and organizational ethics experience. Beth Gillaspey is a Westminster member, ruling elder, and a member of several church committees. Beth teaches English to non-native speakers at Wellstone International High School. Before we get started, here are a couple of items. For those attending in person in the Meisel room, raise your hand at the end of their presentation, please. And we will bring a microphone to you so that all, including those on the live stream, can hear your question or comment. For those attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we will monitor and raise your question or comment. Also, as part of our ongoing effort to promote respectful conversations around concerns in our community, the Social Justice Team has established guidelines for the social justice forums that you will see on the screen. Please take a moment to review these.
They're also on your table, if that's easier for you to read.
So now, please welcome Beth and Anna for today's forum.
So we thought we would actually start with a little prayer this morning as a way to ground our conversation. This is just a way to remember that in the work that I do in the Presbytery, I'm always trying to remember that this is always grounded in our faith, right? This is work that we are doing because we are believers in a gospel of liberation, a gospel of wholeness, and a gospel of justice. And so with that, I invite us to take a breath together and find a prayerful position in our bodies. Holy One, God of justice, breathe into being in us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of voices from our community. Guide our speech and our self-awareness so that we may honor the divine in all people. May it be, and amen.
Good morning. So many of you may have heard that in May of this year, we finally finished our report, the Antiracism self-assessment report for the Presbytery. It was a long, how long, like 3 years? 3 years. We didn't think it was going to take 3 years, but it did. And it was finished and approved by the Presbytery at the May meeting. This is the name of it, Recalibrating Our Spiritual GPS. And it can be found at this website. And there will even be an audio format available soon. So if you are interested in reading it, we would love for you to read it. If you're interested in listening to it, you can do that soon. There will also be a small group discussion guide available soon if you're interested in going deeper with a small group to really reflect on what it says and how we can implement it to move forward on our anti-racism journey. We'll give a sort of very brief overview of a little bit, but mostly we didn't want to stand up here and read something and tell you about something you can read yourself or listen to yourself. So we're going to kind of use this as a grounding, but then talk about how we move forward with this information that we found in the report.
And Beth, I would just add too that part of the reason we didn't want to just summarize the top 10 takeaways from a report is because the report is meant to be experienced. So the writing team and the launch team for this report really designed it to help everybody go on a journey through this conversation, through the way that they had to have 3 years to sort of digest and metabolize what they were learning, to also bring everyone else along on a little bit of that journey as well. So please don't make this sound like we're not at all trying to make this sound like we didn't want to tell you about it. We do want you to read it and learn about it, but because so much effort was put into the how of the report, we've heard a lot of feedback from people saying this isn't like any other report I often read like this. So please do take a chance to take a look at it and see what's different there.
And it's also filled with stories that we encountered throughout our journey, and we just wouldn't have enough time to summarize all those stories, plus stories shouldn't necessarily be summarized. They should be heard in their entirety and to really get the full impact of how powerful they were. So why this report? This report was important because this is part of the gospel imperative. This practice of becoming more anti-racist, of working towards a more just world, this is at the core of our faith. And I'm going to borrow your computer here. I'm going to read one of the quotes from our charge from the Presbytery, which was to understand and claim the gospel imperative to undertake anti-racism work as work that examines structures, systems, and norms, and not just attitudes and options. So that was part of our charge from the Presbytery when we undertook this work. And it's helping us to retrain our focus away from only thinking about explicitly racist beliefs or attitudes as what anti-racism is, as really towards the structures of the inequity and structures that we all exist in, whether we consider ourselves active fighters in the journey towards anti-racism or not, because we all live in these structures, we all exist in these structures, and the danger is that they can become part of us without us even realizing it, because they're so ingrained in our culture, in our daily life, in the systems that we live in. And so that's part of why it took us 3 years, is because those structures are so ingrained that it can be hard to really tease them out and get at what they are, and then really start that revisioning process of what a different world would look like. So this is what we sort of came up with, was that we really do need a culture shift, because a lot of these anti-racist or a lot of these racist systems are so embedded within everything that without a sort of culture shift, we're not going to make that progress that we really need for full transformation, no matter how many people want that. Because we really do believe that people want that, but it's just really hard to do that work to get there. So one of the recommendations that we had in the report was to develop grounded community norms. And so our vision for this recommendation was to change how we interact on a daily level in meetings and community spaces of the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area, to be more courageous, joyful, collaborative, and loving, and always grounded in our gospel call to equity and anti-racist practice. And so part of that is developing explicit community norms for the PCTA spaces, which is part of what you see on these tables, is something that the social justice team is trying to do, is to have these norms for our community time together. And it's all a work in progress. We keep going, but this is sort of our beginning. And this is complicated work, right? This isn't something that's super easy. This isn't something that we're going to be able to just do with one report and say, congratulations, we solved it. But it's really very complicated, and Anna's going to add a little about the words here.
Yeah. So the only thing I wanted to add here is, as Beth and I were talking about this, we were sort of thinking about, but people, all of us, I do too, tend to think of the word complicated as something undesirable. And in fact, it often is. Like, what's complicated? Bureaucracy, healthcare in this country, right? That sort of thing. Complicated may not always be a good thing. But at the same time, if we have a mindset shift to understanding that there are complex systems that are signs of resilience, signs of health, signs of flexibility, signs of being a dynamic system. Something like that would be the ecosystem of this world, right? Having all sorts of ways of accomplishing similar things, trial and error being a part of the process, and resiliency that's built into the system. So we thought it might be a helpful way to reframe the fact that, yes, there will be some like getting sort of lost in the weeds for a minute, or trying something out and it doesn't work, so on and so forth, that will be a part of this transformational work if we're really going to commit to a culture shift together. But that isn't necessarily bad. We're building back the resiliency of our systems. We're building back the health and the sort of flexibility that we may have lost due to these structures and sort of the rigidity that they put into our spaces. So just food for thought in terms of, like, what does it look like to be lush like an ecosystem in terms of the ways we accomplish this work, and not necessarily thinking of it as a problem.
So real change really requires us to undo those ingrained beliefs and patterns, both in our systems, which we were looking at with the PCTA and the report, and in ourselves, which isn't easy. And that's why this work is best done in community. So a community like this, where we come together on Sunday mornings to get to know each other, to talk about tough issues. That way we can support each other, we can encourage each other. It's just, we can't do it alone, right? If it's a complex system, if we're thinking of nature, if we're thinking of the ecosystem, that's not something that one individual does alone. We have to do it in community.
So some of the possible culture shifts that could start happening are some of the things that you see up on our screen, and I just wanted to take a second to have us pause and think about what that might mean. One of the key findings of the report was that we have a tendency in this presbytery, and really these findings aren't just limited to this presbytery as some sort of specific manifestation that's so different from the way that racism can get embodied in many of our spaces, but that one thing we tend to do is that we tend to view relationships as transactional, and community spaces the same way. So what do I get out of this, and what do I put in so that I get out what I want, right? And we do that to individual relationships as well, right? And almost reducing them to commodities, right? To, who do I know, or how can we get so-and-so to be on this group, or a certain diversity level, things like that, right? So you can maybe think of how this looks in a workspace that you've been in, or, in a prior church that you've been in, and then imagine, like, where might some of those behaviors be manifesting in the spaces here even, right? So none of this is intentional, but it does happen, and we can even turn this into the ways that we view educational and spiritual formation in our church spaces, and also even our mission work. And that, I think, is particularly challenging, because I don't think any of us would want to think that we are being transactional about how we are of service in the world. But that is, in fact, part of what we found in the report, because we were listening to voices in communities of color. We were even listening to white people who were saying, gosh, I think maybe my church space does this, or my community space does this in our presbytery. So I think that's a really notable thing and very sobering. Another piece is recognizing that we can tend to intellectualize the changes and the conversations that we even talk about. And that can be very tricky, because racism was never really intellectual to begin with, right? Like, it had a lot of pseudoscience built into it. It had a lot of economic theory that was, formed around it that wasn't actually very good theory. But it isn't an intellectual pursuit, right? It's a pursuit of things like power, right? Which has much deeper roots in our bodies. And so recognizing that there might need to be a shift from intellectualizing how we learn, how we do our spiritual formation, how we understand the world around us and the justice issues that are in it, doesn't mean we don't use our brains, right? It doesn't mean we don't care about understanding the issues, but it does mean that we need to start embodying what is this calling me to do different, to show up differently in my body, in the spaces that I'm in? So what would it look like if after every spiritual formation class here in Westminster or in some of our other congregations, we asked ourselves, what is changing in my body as I hear this conversation, as I've been in this space? I don't think I've ever done that before in many spiritual formation type classes, but I know that the embodiment work that I have done and continue to do has been transformational. So I think there's an invitation there. And finally, the piece about consumerist to collaborative cultures. So consumerist cultures have a tendency to do things like, okay, well, what I'm looking for is X. We all know about the phenomenon of church shopping, right? So maybe that piece is familiar to us, but that same idea of like, well, if I don't get X or Y out of it, it's kind of tied to the transactional piece too, then I'm maybe not very interested, right? I'm here to see what I can find and the best place to find it and get my thing and go, right? Whatever it is, a feeling, a sense of connection, and so on, but I'm really just here for the limited time that I need to get what I want, and then, maybe leave the space. So moving from that to a collaborative model would mean that I'm not here primarily focused on what I can receive from a space, but on what the dynamic energy will be as we engage together. What will each table in this particular space engage in together in a way that creates collaboration, that builds ideas together, that builds dreams together, that starts to think again about how our bodies can shift in how we be in this work. So that's just a brief overview of some of these invitations to shift. And we're gonna go back to this in a second, but just starting to recognize like there may be some places where you're feeling a little stuck as you hear these and say like, wait, how is that bad? Or wait, I don't think I do that, but what would that look like if it was true about this space? So just maybe notice that and we'll come back to it.
And so this isn't something, like we said, that is going to happen overnight. So it's a cycle. So if this seems tricky, if it seems overwhelming, if this is new to you, or even if it's something you've heard of before, but you still are struggling with it, that's normal. I think we all are still struggling with it because it's not an easy process. But it is a process. It's a cycle. And so, maybe we start with the knowing because we're the most comfortable. So we learn something and we know about it. And then if it's really going to change us, if we're really going to grow, if we're really going to make progress, we have to go and do something about it. And that doesn't have to be going to like solve a problem in the world. It could just be a different way that we go about our lives. How we do our lives is a little bit different. How we are in our relationships is a little bit different. And as we do differently, that leads us to being differently. We start to internalize that new way of being. We start to become more in tune with ourselves, more in tune with what's going on in our bodies. And then that can lead us to more knowings, that can lead us to more doings. And it can be a cycle where we can really start to grow and change, and that can lead to change in the world beyond just a surface level. We really need all three pieces to really make that change.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, Beth. And I think that this cycle, just to say quickly, I think that there's really no wrong place to start here, right? Like, I don't think anyone would be like, don't do anything or anything like that. However, I would want to suggest that the most powerful place to start is the be, right? The most powerful place to start is to start with, how am I going to be in this space, or how am I being in ways that might get in the way of or actually enhance what I could learn, right? What I could know, or how I could listen differently, right? Because if I'm not starting with my being, I might not even be able to really take in the opportunities for learning and growth that I'm actually being offered, right? And I see this all the time. I see people who engage with, it doesn't have to be with me, but with other folks, although it has happened with me too, where, the point of what I was trying to say just kind of goes whoop right over people's heads, not because they're not smart at all. It's because in their bodies, they were listening for something different, and they got what they wanted out of it and missed what I was trying to invite, or what another educator was trying to invite. And so just recognizing that how we be, how we show up, what we do with our bodies in a space is going to change what we can actually receive. So then, and then likewise, like how we do actually shifts what the effect is, and so on and so forth. So there is no wrong way to start here. This is not in any way a discouragement, but I just wanted to invite the fact that maybe that B quadrant is the most important piece. And again, you might see some of that reflected in the report. So speaking of how we be, we're going to lean into the next half of this, which is sort of like, what are some ways we could put this into action, some starting points, right? Like this isn't, here's the whole way to do it or anything like that, but just some ideas to get our conversation started in this Christian community about what could this be. So what does how do we be differently? And I would argue that some of that is going to have to be through paying attention to what is going on in our bodies. And some people do this in very active ways. I happen to like mountain biking and commuter biking and things like that. So that is actually one way I pay attention to my body. I'm not talking about for fitness, but like to just literally check in. Where am I today? Where is my energy? How am I doing? Where is there tightness in me? And that tightness could be from sadness. It can be from the sense of ease could be from joy, right? But if I'm not ever checking in, I'm not noticing those things. So there's lots of active ways to do this, but there's also a powerful contemplative tradition that Christianity holds within it. I mean, how many times did it say Jesus was off somewhere praying, right? That's some of the genesis of our beautiful contemplative traditions that we have within our faith. And there's power in those as well, and in other traditions across the globe as well. So all that to say, there's lots of ways to think about how we be in our bodies differently, and I want us to invite ourselves to just try one today. So simple practice, I invite you to just find a comfortable position in your seat if you're not in one already. And what we're going to do is with eyes open or closed, and again, if any of this is uncomfortable for you in terms of like if you're having physical discomfort today or anything like that, please don't feel the need to do things exactly the same as I'm guiding them or as the person next to you, right? So just do what feels right for your body. But what we're going to do is some brief just kind of opening our bodies up. And then we're going to just check in for just a brief moment with our bodies. So with that, it might be moving our arms. It might mean just like, noticing where our posture is at. And I'm not asking for y'all to have correct posture. That's not what we're doing here today. So it's just noticing what's happening in our bodies. So with that, I just want to invite you to just like stretch your arms a little bit around you. And if you're next to someone, just do whatever's comfortable without, knocking someone in the face. So just stretch your arms a little bit. Feel where you feel the edges of your stretch, where the muscles really activate. If you have any pain in joints or anything, you don't have to push beyond what feels comfortable, but just feel those arms moving. And then, very simply, if you feel comfortable, just wiggle your feet a little bit. I know sometimes this feels like very simple, but you're just waking up your muscles, you're waking up your body. Just getting in contact, because now what we're going to do is we're going to just do a grounding practice. And so now that we've sort of, engaged our body a little bit, I want to invite you to, if it feels comfortable, have your feet on the floor and maybe even rock your feet on the floor so you really get in contact with that, the earth, so to speak, under your feet. And then feel that energy coming up from the ground into your heels, up through your knees, up through your middle body, that center space in your gut, up into your lungs and shoulders and arms. You may find your posture shifting as you do this. That's totally fine, but you are fine as you are. And then up through the neck and the head and out. So we're connected to this energy from the earth around us at all times, even when our feet may not be directly on the dirt. But when we take a moment to check in with our bodies, what we can realize is where is the energy moving and flowing, and where does it feel stuck or stopped? So this practice may feel like it's giving you a lot this morning. It may feel like, I don't know exactly if this is true for me today, but I just want you to notice if there are places in your body that feel like the energy is flowing really well, and you're feeling at ease, or maybe places where the energy feels a little more tight. Sometimes this can be in places like our hands, our shoulders. We can tend to hunch if we're stressed or tired, or even pull our shoulders too far back. In our jaw, behind our eyes. Some of these spaces are spaces of information that tells us if we're tired, tells us if we're tense. Maybe it tells us if we're feeling a big emotion in our bodies. But just take a moment and take a couple breaths here and notice. And if you feel like you want to take a deeper breath, just go ahead and do that. Okay. And if you want, you can bring your eyes slowly open, just kind of focusing on something very close to you, in front of you, to just ground your attention, and then come back to the room. That was so simple. It took, maybe 5 minutes? But that's a practice that we don't often do in our daily lives, maybe because we don't have time. I mean, some of us might have contemplative practices in this room, and that's beautiful, and I appreciate that. But how often do you do that before a stressful conversation? After going through an emotional encounter with someone that you're like, wow, that was really big, and I'm feeling a lot of things. So there are opportunities that we may not have fully explored to think about how we are being and how we're showing up in whatever moment that might be happening in our lives. So I just want to offer that as an invitation, and then we're going to start thinking about how that being, how that noticing can lean into how we do differently.
So one of the big parts of doing that we think is most critical to this anti-racism work is how we do relationships, how we are in relationship to each other. And when we are in those relationships, that's what can help us create the world that we want. We see in Jesus's ministry, he was constantly building relationships with people. That was core to how he was trying to change the world and the systems of the time he was living in, and how he leads us now to continue that work here in our own time. And so we start with those relationships, and we're not proficient yet. That's okay. We don't start knowing everything, and that's why we need relationships, because maybe I know something that you don't, and for sure, many of you know things that I don't, and we know how to do things, and we can help each other. And we know that as we are learning to do differently in our lives, especially those of us who are white-bodied people, we need other people who can kind of help us notice when we're missing things and call us out a little bit when we know that we're trying to do our best, but perhaps we miss something somewhere. And we all make those mistakes, and we all need relationships who can help us call those out and move forward. So to build coalition, community, we need each other to really make these changes happen. And then we really need to understand power to relate in healthier ways with each other. And power is something that's complex. We all have situations where we have more power and situations where we have less power, and it's not something that just resides in any one person always. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next, but we have to understand that to be able to relate in these healthier ways, and we have to start with listening, especially if we are the ones in the situation with more power. We have to start with listening. So like if in my classroom as the teacher, I'm definitely the one with more power. And so if I'm in a situation where I'm having some sort of conflict with a student, or the student isn't meeting my expectations in some way, I have to start by listening to them if I really expect there to be a change. I have to understand, where are they coming from? What's going on for them? What do I maybe need to do differently to reach them better? And so me as the one with the power, I have to be the one to listen first, because I'm the one with the power. So I need to open up first?
So we thought we would actually dip a little deeper into the power conversation, not because, I have done whole multi-day classes on this topic, so we're not going to get into it more than just a very surface level. But the reason we wanted to bring it forth is because this is sort of the key to unlocking that whole cycle from before, right? Is to understand that the being and knowing and doing, part of that work is going to be to be curious about how power plays into those things, right? And so like Beth said, there's no like static power number that each of us carries around with us wherever we go. But there are certain characteristics that we might hold in our literal bodies or in our level of expertise or socioeconomic level that might actually go with us almost wherever we go, right? And so understanding those things matters. So I just wanted to, quickly run over some of these basic things that we could use to sort of pique our curiosity if this isn't something we've talked about as much in our previous work. So first of all, one type of power that I think is really important is human agency, right? Like we all know that human agency is the fuel for so many different things that we do together in our communities, right? Even this space of Westminster came together from just a few folks who wanted to worship together early in the settler days of this space here in Minneapolis. But through their desire to be a part of the gospel witness in this community has grown and changed a lot from what they originally might have envisioned. And that's through the agency of all of you and all the previous generations as well. So agency is really powerful, and that is something that we all have the same amount of. We all have the same amount of agency, but it can be limited by the systems that we are a part of, right? So by things like the next category, which is social advantage or disadvantage. So folks who experience social disadvantage may find that their human agency ends up being or feeling limited in certain spaces and places. So social advantage is things that can be as simple as how tall are you? I use this example a lot because in my house, I frequently get invited to be tall and reach things that are on the higher shelves. For some of my stature, less high statured folks in terms of their physical height, but those shelves weren't made for them, right? And so literally whoever designed the space said it, and I see people nodding here who might have that same painful experience of having to like find a way around spaces that weren't built for you, right? So that is almost as mundane as it can be, and I'm not trying to make that seem shallow or small, but obviously we know that there are systems that have a lot more weight and danger in our society than that, right? Like the way that we organize racial advantage and what we often call privilege, gender, sexual orientation, those sorts of things, disability. All of that is a structure of inequality in our system that can influence how people can express their agency in the world. And finally, positional authority or influence, right? So who do I know? Who am I? How much education do I have? In the space that I'm in, if I'm a teaching elder in a certain space like this one, it may be that people would think that I speak with a different type of authority than say the ruling elders who are in the room. But our ordination that we believe, our ordination is the same. It's just to different types of work, right? And so again, the positional authority can be what's on paper, and then it can be what's lived out in terms of how systems actually function. And I think the final thing to remember about any of this, and again, this was like the super briefest overview, but is to just remember that Jesus spent most of his ministry talking about these things. And we don't often spend time talking about why Jesus in some ways saw thinking about these things and being curious about how they're being lived out in the light of our faith as so important that he stood up with the scroll at the beginning of his ministry in the Gospel of Luke and talked. If you read what he read from the scroll of Isaiah, it talks about these things. It talks about liberating people from these sorts of systems, right? And then a lot of the parables, a lot of the teaching ministry that he did. So all of that to say, power is actually thinking about it, being curious about it, thinking about how we transform it to be something healthy among us instead of something that just creates hierarchies and disadvantage or an unfair advantage. that is gospel work. And so as we think about that, we can think about our being and knowing and doing in that particular light. With that, we're going to do some conversation.
And so actually, before we let you ask us questions, we're going to have you talk to each other. But we wanted to put these up here also as norms to keep in mind as you are talking in your groups. So we want to, hopefully people will have equity of voice. We're not going to have a long time to talk, so we want to hope that everyone in the group will get a small time to share. We hope that you will feel curious to listen to others around you. When you're asking questions, we are asking for concise questions because we don't have a whole lot of time. As we're listening to each other, we listen from the heart and with compassion, and then we honor the image of God, working to avoid stereotypes and generalities, especially those related to the specific racial and ethnic members of our community. And as a reminder, these are also on your table. So as I go to the next slide, you will still have access to them. So this is what I want you to talk about. And if you are at a table with just a couple people, you are welcome to just talk with whoever you're sitting with or join together into a bigger group somehow. We welcome you to do what feels most comfortable to you, but we want you to talk to each other about these questions, which are apparently both number one because Google did something strange.
They're both equally important.
That's why they're both number one. There we go. So how often do you consider interpersonal power dynamics when you listen and speak with others? Is this something that you are aware of frequently, or is this sort of a new concept for you? That's the first number one question. And the second number one question is there a time or place when it's more common for you to pay attention to this? And if it's not common for you, why not? So we want you to discuss maybe for, 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll come back together and have some time to share out your conversations and also ask questions of Anna and myself.
And pay attention to your embodiment as you talk, right? Like where is the being and how are you being in this moment? So take a couple moments together and find a circle to chat with.
And if you're on the live stream, please feel free to put any comments in the chat, and perhaps other people on the live stream will also put their comments in the chat, and you can engage with each other in that way, virtually.
Okay. Let's come back together.
We're very sorry to make you stop these conversations, but we want to know, maybe, I'll go back to the questions. If anyone wants to share anything from their group, Suzanne will bring you a microphone. Or if you have any questions for us, you could ask questions for us. Maybe something that came up in your group. Maybe you want to share how your body felt during the conversation rather than sharing the content of what you were talking about. But we have about 10 minutes for any and all questions, comments, noticings, wonderings. We just want to make sure we use the mic so that the people on the live stream can be included.
I got hot enough to put my hair up.
Our body temperature does change in these conversations. That is an important noticing. Like, where are my hands cold? That's good noticing. Am I suddenly like having just like a moment of like a heat wave? Those are really good noticings. There's things that are happening in our bodies that make that happen. Other things.
Oh, we're coming.
And others where I just feel like my body is like, ooh, standing at attention. Because myself, with all the interactions and what I do in the church and how I choose to participate to help improve my awareness, I go, and then I don't know what to do about it. So I feel like at that next stage, and I feel like my body just goes, whoa, that was a powerful statement, and then I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
Or how to respond.
So you mean like when you're listening, you can feel something happening in your body, and there's like a big moment of sort of like your body, maybe an adrenaline rush or something like that, and then being unclear about how to respond. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes that can happen, and sometimes it can happen because it's a positive thing that's happening in the moment that we're responding to, and sometimes it can be because there's something, a moment of tension or a real conflict has shown up.
We have a question or a comment from the chat.
Great. Yeah, here's a great illustration. One of our online participants says, as the daughter of a minister, I am sometimes asked to pray for someone who has special needs or is going through tough times. I'm concerned that perhaps those asking may see me as somehow closer, air quotes, to God. How can I reply without making the person feel less comfortable or competent about their own power in prayer?
How many of us have experienced that moment with, who would like to open this meeting or close this meeting in prayer? And there's just like this dead silence, and the whole room like freezes. It's like, don't move, don't flinch. Nobody wants to volunteer. I think that's a great question, right? How do we hand off authority for engaging with something like prayer, which is one of, I don't think that most of us think of it this way, but it's one of the simplest things we can do. But we turn it into this complex thing that only some people are good at. You can be good at prayer just by doing it, right? So yeah, and we can hand off a certain authority to people who we see as being good at it. You're good at it because you're breathing, right? Yeah.
Not to leap into solutions, but I'm wondering, in addition to handing off, there might be inviting in with. And so there might be an opportunity to invite that inviter to join and participate as part of the prayer.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of times when it comes to something like prayer, it can be a microcosm of a lot of other ways power is operating in our systems, right? Or systems of privilege might be showing up, things like that, right? So power can exist on multiple levels, right? There's that positional authority, or there's that soft positional authority of being the daughter of someone who, but then there's that piece of, is there a social advantage or privilege showing up? How does gender, sexual orientation, race even show up into who is seen as having that authority? Right? There's actually a church conflict going on in New York right now of a congregation that is being, it's a congregation of color actually, but they're going through an issue around gender and who is called to lead that congregation. And so this shows up in a lot of our spaces, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that this is because this is a community of color. We all have ways that we need to divest from different systems. And the work to be done at Westminster is the work to be done at Westminster. So we don't need to worry about other communities, but it's just to recognize that there are ways that this can show up in a lot of different spaces and levels. Joe.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question from the earlier part of the conversation today, where you brought up the idea of shifting from intellectualizing to embodiment and paying attention to embodiment. I certainly have heard just in many contexts invitation to pay attention to our bodies or references to the fact that we are embodied creatures. Could you say more about the connection between paying attention to one's body and a posture of anti-racism?
Okay. So I think, thank you, Joe, for that question. I think it's really powerful that we make that connection, because embodiment work, when we're talking about living into transformational anti-racism work, right? That culture shift that brings us beyond sort of like, I'm using the correct words, I'm not saying anything that's explicitly racist in an obvious way, right? Like it takes us past those sorts of box checking toward I am actually doing and being differently in this world, it's body work, right? Because racism started with human bodies, right? The Catholic Church, and this was because it was the only church back then, the Christian church, I should say, in some ways, decided that some bodies were more valuable than other bodies because it was making them money, right? And so bodies are the starting place of this whole conversation. And if we don't think about our bodies, there's no way we're going to heal from racism. And there's no way we're going to heal from the issues of gender inequity in this country and in the world and all those sorts of things. So there's lots of ways that bodies show up, but absolutely in the issue of racism. So just recognizing that like the work of fixing this is healing the spiritual breakage that happened when the Christian church decided that some bodies weren't as worthy of being seen as image of the divine as others. And that is a sin, and we can all say that, but that doesn't mean that there isn't work in each of us to heal.
So I'm going to add one thing, and then I think we're going to let Suzanne wrap us up. So for me, one thing that is important with the embodiment is getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, because to do this anti-racism work, we have to put ourselves in situations that feel uncomfortable. And I think if we're not paying attention to our body, it can be really easy to just get out of those situations without even realizing why we're getting out of those situations, because we're not recognizing that the discomfort is coming from doing something hard that you're not sure you're going to do right, but you have to try anyway, because that's how you move forward and become more anti-racist. And so if you're not able to be in your body and feel those feelings of discomfort and say, okay, this means that this is a hard thing that I'm trying to do, but I'm going to try it anyway, then we're not going to be able to move forward. So I think for me, that's another way that embodiment is important, connected with anti-racism.
That's so powerful because it's so practical. So yes, absolutely.
Before we thank them, I would like to invite you. Next Sunday is World Communion Sunday, and we will welcome a team from Advocates for Human Rights sharing their work and presenting opportunities for engagement. And we look forward to seeing all of you then. We would like to thank Anna and Beth, and they are going to close our time with prayer.
All right, so will you please pray with me? God of wholeness, as we take the transformation of this encounter into the week ahead, guide us as we seek to become friends to the land in Minnesota Makoche and follow its traditional stewards, the Dakota and Ojibwe, as we act to be courageous stewards of our resources and good neighbors in this city. May it be. Amen. Thank you for coming.